Park Flyer Podcast, Episode 6, Receivers.
Welcome to the Park Flyer Podcast, where we discuss the ups and downs of the new RC Flyer. Join your hosts, Michael and Jay, as they take flight at the park. Now on with the show.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Park Flyer Podcast. We are joined today by our co-host, Jay.
Hey, it's Jay in the AK.
And today, Jay, we have a very special guest. It's Larry Martin from Colorado Springs. Larry, how you doing?
Just fine. How you guys doing?
We're doing very well. Hopefully you're staying nice and cool or warm, I guess, in your case.
It has been chilly today.
Did you get to fly today?
Yeah. We got to fly at about 24, 25 degrees and 5 or 6 miles per hour out of the north. Made your eyes water a lot, but it's still a lot of fun.
I don't know how your eyes watering is a lot of fun, but okay.
Yeah, and your frozen fingers.
We were flying slow sticks and modified little airplanes, so we didn't have to worry too much about it either way. We kind of took them up and kited them around in the wind, So, just fun stuff.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that.
It's nice. Hey, so Larry, can you tell us a little bit about your group of guys you fly with up in Colorado?
I fly with several groups up here. We have what we call the church group, and the church group is made up of just individuals from various clubs that show up at this particular location where we're allowed to fly whenever we want. They even set up a nice little sign that says low-flying aircraft, and in the parking lot they put down a runway for us with markings, stuff down the middle. It's really cute. I fly there with a group of guys. Most of them aren't there when it gets this cold. Some of them take off for, Florida and Texas and so forth, and they're gone. But some of us diehards that stick around, we fly down there, like this morning. And I still go out to a field. We joined a field here. So I'm like parts of 3 different groups here. Also the Glider Flying Soaring Society, which is a lot of guys we even have a rocket scientist, believe it or not. The other thing that we have out there is a regular field where we can use big power planes and so forth. So, to ask me kind of what we have, it's a big variety of a lot of different people.
Nice.
Sounds like you're a busy guy.
Try to be.
Well, we had an episode not too long ago on radios. We talked a little bit to our special guest, Mike Barsalou. He had a Tyrannus. And understand you're familiar with radios as well, and more of the Spectrum line, if I recall.
The Spectrum is my primary radio. I did try the line that he's talking about where you can put the open source software on it. And I had a Skyfly or Fly Sky, whichever way it goes.
Yeah, Free Sky.
Free Sky? Okay. This particular one, we did put the software on it. It was more cumbersome to use, but like even Mike from AK said, it's just your ignorance of how to use this thing. And once you learn how to use it, it's okay. It's just there still are some other shortcomings that I think are major. And this is what I was telling Mike about here, Mike in Arizona, is that one of the big concerns is that you can test these things out. We actually have a location where we can use radios and so forth. And we use my DX9 and we use that Free Sky radio. And we tried different receivers with both, tried them at different polarizations and everything over a 2.25 mile range. We got them all to work. His worked fine. His being I can't remember what that protocol is, but it is different than the DSMX and DSM2s and DSM. I think they even have a new one, DSMR.
I think they call that the OpenTX for the FR Sky. That's the firmware that Mike was talking about. Was called OpenTX.
Okay.
Yeah, that's on the radio, but I think Larry's talking about is the protocol that the radio actually sends its signal out. Basically, he's talking about the protocol that the radio is broadcasting over. I don't know what the Free Sky radio what their protocol is, but
so ours is the DSM and the DSMX. Those are the ones that the Spectrum uses, right? And then the FR Sky uses something different?
Yes, as well as the Taba. They're all different. They use their own type. That's why you've noticed that once you lose signal, you gain it back very quickly with the Free Sky type radios and receivers, whereas as 1 second, that's what we identified on this end when we tested them. whereas the spread spectrum is actually about 5 seconds for it to link and find its frequency and lock on.
Now, 5 seconds can be a lifetime in this sport. We talked about that before, but 1 second versus 5 seconds, if you're low to the ground or you're doing 3D and you lose something like that, it's troublesome. That 5 seconds can be, devastating to your aircraft. You were saying that you tested various receivers. Is that what you were talking about? That you had many different brands of receivers that you tested?
That's correct. We tested Spectrum, we tested Lemons, and we tested Orange. We tested 2 different Lemon ones, one with the gyro that has the single antenna, and we also tested those inexpensive units that have the 2 dipoles coming off of each end away from each other. We tested and found that the Orange would not even work at 2 1/4 miles. We had to come into 1.25 miles to get it to even work. But even the ones that we tested at 2 1/4, if you change the polarity between the antenna, the polarization, so that if you have both your radio up in the air and your antenna up in the air, it'll work fine. But as soon as you turn one of them 90 degrees, that lack of polarization would cause a problem and you would get a dropout. But we found that they didn't drop out at all at 1 1/2 miles. That's why you kind of want to have an antenna system that's either diverse, the diversity systems, or you want to have dual antennas, or take one of them, leave it vertical and leave the other one horizontal. So you cover both those polarization. The main thing we discovered was that even though they'd work at 2 1/4 miles, if you brought that radio and system in, we would do a range test. At full power range test, it would fail at about 50 to 100 feet if you're in a very noisy environment. We fly at this church area, and they have a repeater sitting on a tower, which is very close. They have all kinds of medical offices around there that are shooting streams to the main hospital, and all that interference would knock those radios out, so they cannot even be utilized at all in that location. So it's just something to think about.
So Larry, we're actually discussing the receivers versus the radios, right? The radios are putting out a transmitter signal, and the receivers that will interconnect or handshake with the radio that you have. So if we have a DSM-X or we have a DSM-2, those are the type of receivers, and I think the ones you mentioned, the Lemons and the Spectrums and the Orange, they all have that capability, so I could use them with my Spectrum radio. We're not talking about the signal coming out of the radio. We're talking to the signal coming into the receiver. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I think that's about the same thing, isn't it? Yeah.
Are they one and the same? I mean, the radio is sending the signal out one direction, and then you just said to turn your antennas 90 degrees to each other, but you're talking about the receiver.
I'm talking about the receiver antenna, but it's in reference to the transmitter because it's an envelope that is radiating from this antenna on the radio. So by changing the polarization, you're changing that envelope to a point where you will get a dropout because the signal is not as strong at that angle, I guess you could say. And even if you throw that all out and forget about that, as long as you keep your antennas one turn one way, one the other, you shouldn't have to worry too much about it, or run like a 9, our DX9s and the 18s, and I think even some of the new Gen 2s, they put that dual antenna system in there so that you actually do have one that's in the little stem that sticks out. It's polarized vertical, and then you have one in the handle, which is polarized horizontal. So you're getting that effect, which really cuts down on the dropouts or brownouts.
Well, that makes sense. I just, sometimes if our listeners are new, I just want to make sure that we're talking to them, that they understand what we're talking about. So basically the radio itself has a radio signal that goes out, and then you have to have the receiver that actually accepts that. There's many different DSM-2 and DSM-X type receivers out there. Some are more expensive than others. They can be used with multiple radios. However, FR Skies and the Spectrum ones, I think, are not compatible.
No way.
So you actually have to have a module on the FR Sky, or you have to have something different. You can't buy a Spectrum receiver and use it on your FR Sky. Your FR Skies.
Right. Now, the FR Sky, the great thing about those is that you can buy modules that you could run Futaba. You could buy a Spectrum module, a JR module, a Futaba module, plug them in the back, and then you can link that radio to one of their receivers, a Futaba receiver to a Futaba module, accordingly. But you just can't plop any receiver in there and just think it'll just work. It has to be compatible.
Well, and it's a brand to a brand,
Yes.
right, Larry?
Yes, well, pretty much. I mean, like we've discussed in one of your previous podcasts, you did come up with third-party units that are using basically a Spectrum chipset. And it does have a lot of capability to perform exactly the same as what a Spectrum receiver would do. You're right, they do have to be different. I did have this other radio. I was able to put in an orange module, which was a JR. And so it would work with the Spectrum receivers, DSM-2. Problem with that is when I was listening to your other podcasts is there is an issue with those that because they are a third party, the Chinese are making these orange units and can be a duplication out there. So that let's say that you walk into a big group of guys flying Spectrum radios and you fire up your module that's riding on your open source radio, you could in fact knock their plane right out of the air by firing that up. That's one of the big problems with it. What they recommend you do is you go to the site and get everybody's radios turned on and make sure that when you turn yours on, you don't have, they can still function. You're not interfering with them. So that's one real bad part. That's why mine's in a box. I no longer use it. I donated the radio to the club because if they get those guys out miles from town where there isn't any interference, those open source radios, Taranis or whatever, work great out there. And some of the guys use them because you can put so many channels on it and you can do all these great functions. So the glider guys love it, but usually you only find a couple, three of them that are willing to risk their $5,000 airplanes on one of these radios that could interfere or drop out. And as you guys talked about, you guys hit so many good things on that other podcast that had all the joysticks and the gimbals are better and so forth on the 9s and 18s of the Spectrum radios that it kind of offsets some of the great advantages that you do get from the other radio. And I think the biggest thing that Spectrum has that only Spectrum has is they have model match. The model match feature lets you make sure that when you connect to your airplane, if it starts to function, you're connected to that airplane, you do not have the wrong model selected. You can't select the wrong model. I'm sure you guys know about this, and that's what I think is great.
Well, I know that happened to me when I first started the radio that I originally had. It would just connect to whatever, and I know when I only could afford a receiver or two that I'd have one model selected, and then I'd plug it into something else, and I'd start the plane would start up or it would do something funky because I had a different model selected, but the receiver had no clue. It was dumb. It didn't know, I'm only for this, for this plane model or whatever. It would just take the last plane model or it would just go do whatever. It was crazy.
So the Chinese, you're telling me that the Chinese were actually using multiple, I don't know what the word is for that, but it's like the old 72 megahertz. You had to, the specific handshake between your radio and the receiver was duplicated, every 5 times or 10 times on the production line?
Yes, you're pretty much right there. It's got, these particular modules will come with 5 different serial numbers per se. And so you can switch it so that it can default to a different one if you do have interference at the field with your particular model. I mean, there's so many millions of keys. I don't know if they call them keys. I can't remember the term. You got to understand this is like 3 years ago when I was doing this. They do have different keys. You can actually get into a problem, but likelihood that you're going to have someone there with your key number is rare, but it can happen, and it does happen from what I hear.
Wasn't the advantage of the DMS-X and the DSM-X2 or the DSM-2 and the DSM-X is that it would constantly shift, kind of like your garage door opener. Every time you push the button, it shifts to a new frequency or a new code, so to speak?
Well, I would say that's what the DMS-X is for. It allows up to, I want to say, 100 or 200 users to be used at one time. And that's the problem with the original DSM. If you got a large group of people, about 50 guys together, you could start having problems with them overriding each other and having the wacky thing of taking control of somebody else's plane. So, yeah, that's partially true.
They've tried since then with the new airware and the new Spectrum receivers with the DSMX2 is to get away from some of that.
Oh, most definitely. That's definitely one of the roles that they're trying to do. Because think about it, most of the time you show up at the field and people just turn the radios on now. Where 10 years ago that was a big no-no. You had to go get your flag, pull it off the thing, make sure you're on that one frequency. I'll say that with the new radios, they have bad habits. No longer does anybody walk up to a field or when they show up and say, "Hey, who's flying what?" Or "Hey, I'm going to turn my radio on. Is that okay?" People just turn the radios on. Nobody even thinks about it. If there's this problem, like I had no idea with the Free Sky that was an issue. I wouldn't think twice about it now. But now that I know, I'll definitely say something when I'm out there with that particular brand of radio.
Larry, if you turn the Spectrum on, it shouldn't interfere with
No, they can't interfere with each other if they have the same code or same key. The one thing I want to clarify, though, is that the problem isn't necessarily with the open source if you're using PPM or something like that. The problem is if you're using the modules. If you use the JR Spectrum module plugged into that radio, now you're converting it to a Spectrum type radio. That's where the problem is, not just if you're using a Taranis out there and you're running, I can't remember, FHSSD or whatever the protocol is. If you're just running that or PPM, it's not a problem.
So as long as they don't have FR Sky radio with a Spectrum module in the back, if he turns his radio on, it shouldn't affect any of my airplanes.
That's correct.
But it's interesting to know that, because if I'm ever out at the field with someone that has one of those radios, it would behoove me, I guess, to go out and make sure that he's running his own receivers and not some sort of a Spectrum clone.
Correct. We had a guy flying with the Sun Valley Flyers that's located down there in Arizona, Cave Creek area, and one of the guys came out with it, and I said, "Do you realize what you have here, how you could take out one of these guys' $70,000 jets that's flying down there once in a while?" And he said, "No, I didn't." So he looked into it, and of course, he never brought it to the field again with that module in it.
Well, that's interesting. I wonder if Mike, AK Mike, knows that as well. That'd be good to share with him, because he's more into that programming and open source TX and dealing with all those guys as well. Now, Larry, you did a little work with the Lemon guys as well.
Yeah, back when they were trying to get their gyro system working, they basically were taking a 6-channel system and making it a 7-channel if you didn't use the gyro, or they made it a 6-channel system with gyro. But when they did that, when they started, they were using the aux frequency or aux1 channel on a 6, which is the highest channel. They were using that to turn on and off the gyro. Well, that's okay unless you're trying to use some kind of flaperons or something like that. So then they moved it to the gear channel on like version 2 or 3. That then posed another problem. So if you're trying to run like a T28 or something like that, and you were trying to run flaps and you wanted to run gear and so forth, then no longer can turn on and off the gyro. And in some cases that's not a big deal, but I like being able to turn the gyro off in case it gets into a problem, or like when you got a new plane, I don't just usually fly it right away with the gyro. I fly it without it, and so on and so forth. So I started working with them, and they were willing to activate the bind, what we call the bind. They put aux2 on there, or aux3, I can't remember what, aux2. They put aux2 on there, and we were then able to move things around. You could get everything working, gear, flaps, and everything. Even though you shut it off with gear, you could move your flaps over to that other bind position and get it to function okay. All in all, I think version 4 pretty much takes care of most of the problems that they had with that thing, but it's a beautiful little gyro for $18.90.
Yeah, I love using Lemons. I've actually converted almost all to Lemons now because they work really well with my DX18. I have several that have gyros. Almost all my airplanes have the little gyros in them. Anyway, I buy the little 6-channel ones for the park flyers, and those work really well, for me as well, because they're easy to work with. You just put them on your park flyer. They're like $5. I buy them 10 at a time, $100 at a time. And I have them pretty much on all of my park flyers. The bigger airplanes that I have, Lemon receivers in have the gyros, but I'm like Larry. I only use them occasionally when I get in the air. I don't take off with them. I land with them, but I don't usually take off with the gyro going.
Usually that's what I do as well. I fly my plane, get it all trimmed out first. Then I turn the gyro on because sometimes the gyro might be out of whack. It may be too sensitive, not sensitive enough, and then all of a sudden you have no control. So I definitely like having a switch to turn it on or off. And also get up about 3 mistakes high, then turn it on and see what it does.
That's a really good idea. That's kind of the way I look at it. On the other hand, I'm playing devil's advocate here. I say I usually don't use it, but if I'm working with someone that's brand new, they just set up their plane and I've gone through it with them and I'm going to help them maiden it. And I know that it's got this particular gyro in it because I'm kind of encouraging a lot of the guys to try this to get used to it. When they do that, I'll go ahead and use it right off the bat. I just want to be able, if it, like we took one of them up and we had too much sensitivity. He was running a 7-channel radio. And so it didn't have the aux2 or aux3, the aux3 setting needed because you want to get that on 8 and higher in spectrum. And that's what they use to set the rate. You can actually set the gain remotely with a pot or a switch with 3 positions, 3 different degrees. It's
nice.
Really cool the way that thing works. His particular one was overreacting. You could see it fluttering. And so I was able to just shut the gyro off and fly it around until we landed it. We then had to go in and, Mike, you're familiar with this, with those controls or pots. You had to readjust the pots and get the ailerons cranked down a little bit so they weren't quite so sensitive for that particular plane. If you do have a 8-channel or more, you can just, change your gain right on the fly. It's really, really handy. You don't have to bring a plane down to do it.
Yeah, you have to be like a microscope to get the pots, man. You have to have the world's smallest screwdriver. I actually have one in my bag, but it's like an eyeglass screwdriver, and I could never see it, even with my glasses. I'm like, which way am I going? But I do like the fact that on my DX18 and when I had my DX9, I could put the gyro gain on my rotary knob. That way, when I'm flying, if it started to act up, I could just rotate the knob down and take some of that gain out. It was a very, very good addition to that
exactly.
that
Awesome.
receiver.
Hey, one thing I really like about Lemon 2, like when Larry was just saying how they were going from version 1 to version 4, it happens really quickly. I noticed one thing about their company. They're very responsive to what the customers are saying or what feedback they're getting and implementing it very quickly within 6 months, it seems, to bring out new product or trying it on new products.
I noticed that when we were going through those 2, 3, and 4, it took actually over a period of like a month to 2 months as they were developing this thing on the front end. So it was very, very quick. Within a year, they went from like 1 to 4.
I found that they were pretty quick at that, but I do know that as far as new products coming out, there's a new product on the market called an Aura 8. It will actually do a 6-channel gyro. I mean, all 6 gyros. It runs everything. And I don't know if Lemon is, looking towards that, but I've noticed that they've kind of stopped with that 7-channel.
You mean stopping building on it or developing it further? What do you mean, Michael?
The Aura 8 can be up to a 42 channels. I mean, I can hook up everything, and it has the gyro in there, where the Lemon comes as I have a 10-channel, but it doesn't have a gyro on it, I don't
doesn't.
believe.
10-channel doesn't. They only make the one gyro, and that's the 6+1 or 7-channel radio or receiver.
Right.
Well, 6+1, yeah, that's right.
My math skills, according to my fingers, 6+1 equals 7.
But it's not 7.
It actually is. You can don't use the gyro, and you get 7 channels out of that particular.
That's true. That is true.
That is correct. That's correct. But once you do turn the gyro on, though, you lose a little bit of that or you lose the 7th channel. So if it was a flap or gear or whatever, in order to exercise it, you have to turn the gyro off and then lower the flaps or gear, and then if you turn the gyro
but
back
you can
on,
get everything you need. You can get on that with the gyro functioning. You still can get basic, the aileron, elevator, flaps, throttle, rudder.
That's if you have everything combined. So my F-18 is the EDF. I have 2 elevators, 2 rudders, 2 flaps, 2 ailerons, a throttle channel, a gear channel. So all of those kind of have to be wide in to the single channel. where my Aura 8, or if I used it as a 10 or 11 channel, I can do all of that separately. I can put 2 ailerons in, I can put 2 rudders in, 2 elevators. That way I can adjust everything
individually.
Yes,
right.
Doing sub trim and so forth.
Correct. And I prefer that when I fly. I prefer to have everything on its own servo that I can, kind of tweak it. I don't really care about my park flyer stuff. I just throw that in there. But when I fly my bigger equipment, my Cubs and my Katanas and my 3D airplanes that are larger, 80 inches, I want to be able to maximize and have multiple servos for control services.
So Larry, why do you think they stopped right with the 7? How come they have up to 10 channel receivers? How come you don't think they added it in receivers higher than that 7?
Well, your guess is as good as mine. I have really no idea, other than I would say the need, the market. I don't know if they would have, for that kind of price range. I just doubt if they can come up with anything else that's going to be that good. And I think they've expanded into telemetry, whereas
Yes.
that you can buy a full telemetry unit from them for like $33 now, which I just looked up the other day. And I thought some of that time's being spent there. Plus, they've gone into diversity. When Michael and I were trying to do this, we were basically looking at DSM-2 receivers that they were selling. And the next year, I think in 15, they started coming out with DSM-X, which is double the price, but $10, for a fantastic receiver. And then in 16, early 16, and to now, they're doing diversity antenna systems, which it'll find the best. It has 2 systems out there reading for signals. So you'll get, in case one portion fails, it can pull from another just instantly. Those cost, I think, about $14 or $15, but still, they've got a lot of capability. I think they're just trying to stay within a certain price range for all their stuff.
Yeah, they're trying to stay within a certain price point with that. Now, the diversity antennas product that they've come out with, I've noticed that it has longer antennas. So is there a difference between the long antenna diversity antennas and the little park flyer diversity antennas?
Well, I think I might be able to handle that one. So the reason that they may be coming out with the ones with the longer whiskers is for guys who are flying quadcopters. And the reason you want to have longer whiskers on a quadcopter is because it's generally made out of carbon. And so you need to get your whiskers out away from the carbon, because the carbon absorbs the signal and it becomes a big, blocking mechanisms to the radio signals. So by having a little longer whisker that either stands up above or gets out from behind the carbon sheet or fiber, then it can be seen much, much better.
So the carbon fiber actually blocks the signal, as opposed to just a regular,
like concrete. Bam, stops it dead.
It's like a lead shield.
It's exactly like that. It's exactly like.
But it's not just normal carbon or composite. Like my glider is all carbon fiber, but it has a small composite section where you can put your antenna.
Right, and that's the reason why they do that. So if you notice that with some of the Spectrum, there's one, I don't remember the name of the receiver, but it's got like really, really long whiskers, and it's specifically designed for going into carbon gliders. And so you can poke a hole underneath your glider, put those whiskers through so that they can be seen, or else you're just putting it into a lead shield, like you said, as you're flying it. So, you can't get beyond 30 feet.
Now, do you need one on top or bottom, or does it matter? I mean, if they're coming out the same way and they're going down the longitude or the long ways of your aircraft, how do you turn 190 and one?
Well, you won't be able to do that. Your aircraft isn't going to be big enough unless you have a really, really big plane. But for a glider or something like that, you're not going to get a true 90 degree like you normally would with the shorter ones.
What a lot of guys do, and I'm sure you guys do it too on some of yours, you think about it, you use satellites. And so you take a satellite receiver and add it to your main receiver, and you can set it with different, polarized differently in the back of the fuselage or something like that, unless it's all carbon.
Yeah. So
It's all ball bearings these days.
yeah, so that's why they just want to have those whiskers hanging out free underneath the plane, just in the airstream. So just you're not getting that, like you said, you're not getting the best 90 degree like you'd want to, but both those whiskers hanging down, at least able to absorb some signal.
Now, how many satellites can you put on a receiver? Is there a limit?
I don't know that answer to that question. I want to say I've seen some spectrum systems or receivers that you can put up to 6 or up to 3 additional satellites on. I don't know about if you could have much more than that.
The Aurora that you were talking about, Michael, it can handle 2 spectrum satellites in addition. It's got some capability.
The Aura 8 that I run on my Katana, it actually uses the satellite radio as the receiver. So I have 2 of them, and they're both plugged in, and they sit 90 degrees to each other. And then the Aura 8 actually is like a controller board for a quad. It runs all my control surfaces. I can do all that stuff on the fly, or I can actually sit on my computer, program it all in, and then when I stick it in the airplane, it works just perfect. And it has a gyro in it that I can either do low, medium, or high, or none at all.
Poof, like magic.
I know, right? It is pretty impressive, but I am a big lemon user. I really like those. I've kind of gravitated. I said on the last podcast that I did have an orange receiver, and I think I crashed the wing, twice, 3 times?
Well, I've gravitated to the lemons as well, because between you and I and AK Mike, I think we've lost at least 3 to 4 aircraft. 2 gliders for sure, like you said, the wing, and I think we just our general park flyer from the oranges, just not working or just losing bind, just doing weird things.
Yeah, my wing, I think we were doing like speed runs with it, and that thing got down to almost over 100 miles an hour. I lost signal, and it pitched right down and hit the ground doing over 100. It wasn't a pretty sight.
Nope.
And it made a very loud noise.
It did, with contact with the ground. Everybody stopped who was walking around there, just stopped and was like, what was that?
Yes, they did. And I think the battery was like 10 feet from where the accident site happened. It was pretty bad. Luckily, though, I replaced it, and now I'm using a lemon receiver in there as well. Larry's done some testing with all this. You mentioned this earlier. What did you find out about the lemons in your tests?
The lemons tested out to 2.25 miles as well. We could have gone further maybe, but that's how far we went. Proved that polarity or polarizing was the same issue. That is when I'm saying same as when comparing to the Free Sky type receivers. The thing is, though, you could bring those in and fly them in this real noisy environment, and they don't ever drop out. I'm not saying never.
It's not a challenge, folks. Don't go out there and stand right next to the radio tower.
We're going to prove Larry wrong. Yeah, we're going to prove him wrong.
Yeah, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
We're headed to the field right now.
We've just had very good luck with those things. And they're just DSM-2s for the most part, except for that gyro, which has only that one little antenna, and it's a DSM-X. I have found that I have not had one single failure with a DSM-X.
Come in. I thought somebody's knocking on the door.
Somebody jinxed themselves. Whoa.
Yeah.
There you go. Fight off the gremlins and demons.
Right.
They're coming. They're coming
That's
for
right. But so you haven't had any failure with the DSM-X or the DSM-2?
No, DSM-2s. We've had a couple times when things have happened that we're not sure exactly why. We talk about this all the time. Was it pilot error? Was it some kind of interference? Did connection come loose? Did the battery fail? Which I've been going through a lot of that here lately with T connector issues. But anyway, that's a whole nother subject, I'm sure. Yeah. Another podcast.
All right. Well, you brought it up. You brought it up, Larry. So we'll touch upon it just a little bit. So, what problems do you? Because I'm a T guy. So, what problems have you been having?
I with you, Jay, am a T guy up until recently. I started out with all the different varieties, JSTs and Ts and any other XT60s and bullets and AC3s, AC5s, and it goes on and on and on. I've tried all kinds of them, but Hobby King kind of forced you there for a while to go with XT60s on most of their stuff because that's what came on their batteries. And until I got away from that, I was pretty much using XT60s. Well, I got tired of trying to pull them apart. And so I kind of started doing some adjustments to them. I would try to, put in some kind of lubrication so that the nylon pieces wouldn't stick together. I tried crimping. Don't ever do that.
Did you do that with the battery on it? Because that's a different subject.
No. The battery, fortunately, it has the female end. The male end was what I was on the each plane. I was just bending them just a little bit until I found out that you can go too far and not know it, and then all of a sudden you'll be flying and they just quit working, and down they come.
Ooh.
So don't ever do that. Don't mess with them. If you get the right versions of these things, they work well. But I had gone to 4-cell and 6 cells on some of the planes I got here now, Michael, which, like my T-28, I went to a 4-cell and I received a Carbon Z from my son. And so he had bullets on it. I didn't want to go to bullets. But to make a long story short, I did get some batteries from Value Hobby, which came with their version of the Dean's connector. It's not a true Dean's. It has a little friction bands on there so to help pull them apart. I'm sure you've seen them.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, they came with those. And so I take my T-28, plug it in, and I go out with it at the last second. Just before I hit the runway, I wanted to make sure that it was working. It was gone. It had gone off. And so I reach inside, just touch the connector, and it went through its initialization report and touched it again, and it just kept falling out. So I had to change out those connectors to a point where what I think it is, it's on Dean's or the T's, I should say, connectors. They have that little spring on the bottom that has to push the contacts together. And that spring on some of them does not have the quality it should. So after a few uses on that plane, it would then go flat and allow those to separate. I decided I didn't want to do that. And it's mainly only when you have rigid cables with like 2200s and up. So you get into real rigid cables and you're trying to fold that inside your area so you can get your canopy on and so forth. That's where you get into a problem with those connectors. And I have not had any problem since I switched to XT60s. And it doesn't matter, whichever ones you want. Anything that's got those bullets that are inside a nylon housing so you have more things to hold it together. I think they just seem to work better for that application. If you don't have a situation where the wires are being manipulated or trying to be folded so you're torquing on that connector, you won't have an issue.
I use XT60s. I've used them since the battery change came. But when I was a Dean's connector guy, and I found that I would inevitably have a cold solder joint on a Dean's. I don't know why. It's easier for me to solder the bullets than it would be to solder the Dean's. But I always, something wouldn't work, and I'd be like, what the heck? And then the cable would come out my hand, or it would just be a cold solder joint.
Right. And I was ready to say that's usually the problem that most people have with Dean's. Either they get cold solder joints, or the opposite. When they're soldering the Dean's together, or they're putting the connection on, they have too much heat and they actually melt the housing.
I've done that.
So they melt the housing, and therefore it can wiggle in there. And just the scenario that Larry just told, that little spring, or that little, it's not actually a spring, but the tension that's on that bottom wire or flap or whatever it is gets loose because it got melted in there. And so you don't get a good connection. So that happens as well. So yeah, that does happen, guys. I have to admit, I'm a Dean's guy just because I'm hard-headed. I've done the whole connector thing, and then when they forced me to change, Hobby King went to that XT60, I just refused. And so I was just stuck with Dean's. And so it's just not out of a personal because it's way better or anything like that. It's just because I'm too lazy to switch all my stuff back over to XT60s. I'm just going to wait till all my batteries die out, and then I can just then I'll make the change. But right now, no way.
And when he comes to my house, I have an actual adapter so he can use. I made like 3 adapters for him when he comes down here. I just throw him in my bag. It's like, oh, I don't have a battery, to fit this anymore. And he goes, oh, I do. And I'm like, oh, you're a Dean's connector versus XT60. Luckily for me, I have this neato, it's only about 2 inches long, but that saved us more than once when I was pretty much out of batteries and he still had a couple left. So I snagged his batteries. But I will tell you, though, that there's been huge discussions on the boards and at RC groups. And I think the AMA actually had an article on Dean's connectors. And I know, Jay, when I was up there at your club, they brought this up too, is how much a Dean's connector can actually take as far as the amperage. Because once you get over a 4 or 5 cell battery,
yes, that's very true.
You really
that's very
true. Really need to go, you really need to go to a bullet connector, because my 6 cells, I think they have the EC5s on them, because it's just, I mean, you can hear the spark when you put those things together.
Yeah,
That's
sounds like you're arc welding.
It really does. But I have those, and I have, what's the other one? The 100s that come with they spin together. They're actually separate. They're not in a connector.
Oh,
AST 100s, I think is what they call them, or AS 100s. But they have like a spark arrestor on it, and that's what I use for anything larger than a 6 cell.
right. And I do kind of the same thing. Mostly any plane that I have that has the 6 cell, I use the bullet connectors. So I don't use my Deans for anything above 5 or 6 cells whenever I use them. Only up to about 4 cells. That's all I use Deans on.
I think they're limited. If I'm not remembering this correctly, I think they are limited to 45 to 60 amps.
Yeah, I think it's below 80. Anything below 80, you could use them.
I think it's below 80. That sounds right. So maybe that could be a problem too, there, Larry, if you're using them on a larger 6 cell.
Well, I'm sitting here listening to all this, and when I received this, the Sun had taken off the AC3s, which are rated for, I don't know, 50 amps or so. And that's what came on the Carbon Z. He took those off and put on bullets that were the 6mm type, 160 amp capable.
Oh, power.
Big.
Well, so I took those back off.
Yeah. Now we hear the rest of the story.
Well, okay. Now you guys that are familiar with big batteries, I wasn't. And so you look inside this plane and you see these 2 connectors floating around in there, and the connectors on the battery are floating around, and they could go together where they shouldn't be. You could actually plug the battery into itself, which wouldn't be good. If you're trying to look inside, you had to make sure you're grabbing the right components. If your leads aren't real long and it's hard to see, down inside the Carbon Z, it's a little hard to see down in there, and the way they got the ESC position and everything, they just aren't long enough. So I went to an XT60 in that last week when I had a chance. And even though I hate XT60s, I still like them better in that huge environment. 6 cells, this thing can develop 1,200 watts, 1.2 horsepower.
Wow.
But that's still, if you work it out with the voltage, it only is about 45 amps. So it's, it's well within the range of the 60 amp XT60s. That's what they're rated at. 60. And the new ones, by the way, they just came out with are 65 amps. So.
Yeah, they also came out with an XT90. Yep. I think there's a 90 amp one. And
yep.
It's a little bit larger for bigger. And it has a spark arrestor in it as well.
Yep, you can get them with.
I haven't used any of those, but while we're talking about these, I will tell you that Jay and I both use, and I don't know, Larry, you can chime in if you use one, but we actually have a neat little unit that sits on the bench, and it actually has holes for all of the, from like 1 all the way to 6 bullet connectors, and then the XT60, Deans, XT90s. You push it down in there, and it'll hold your connector in place while you solder it on there. It's very, very easy, and it's very neat, and it's made out of, I think, a rosin, and so it doesn't collect any heat, and it won't melt your housing. Because, when you have the helping hands or the little alligator clips, occasionally you'll touch the plastic, and, of course, your soldering iron is hot, and so it melts some of the plastic. But this will actually hold all of the plastic, and then you can just heat up the tip of it and push the wire straight down into the solder. So I have 2 different types. I know Jay has one because I got it for Christmas. But, it works very, very well. I'll try to post a website link to it, or at least a picture so you can kind of see it. But they're very, very good soldering aid. Pretty
much, I agree with you.
I've seen those as well. I haven't purchased one. I just saw one the other day and I was thinking, I ought to get one of those. But what I've been doing is I take an old set of connectors. And so if I'm soldering the male version of an XT60, I plug the female version into the other side, and it's already got
pretty smart.
Insulation protecting it so that, nothing can short together just in case it fell against something or whatever. So it's protected. And that tells me, don't solder on this one. Solder on the other side. Because I've done that.
You solder them backwards.
Oh, I've done that. I've done it where I've taken the mating sections and put them together so they would protect it from heat, but then I'd solder to the wrong one. So I finally decided to put some kind of shrink tubing on the one that's just used for the purpose of pulling off some of that heat so you don't damage the shell or whatever on the other side.
I had a battery. Well, actually, I had an ESC, and I soldered it, and I actually buy the silicone wire to solder, my own when I up the wire a little bit. And so I had the battery on one side. I did the same thing you're talking about, Larry. I put the two together, and I soldered the black wire on the red side and the red wire on the black side accidentally. I wasn't really thinking about it, but then when I went out to the field to fly this thing and I went to go plug it in, I'm standing there with this plug in one hand and the battery in the other going, well, this can't be right. This can't be right. This does not look right at all. And I didn't fly that day because I was real nervous about plugging this thing in because I couldn't remember if I plugged it in the wrong side polarity wise. Now, if I do that again, I just use either two black wires on the ESC.
Oh, so you mean there was no magic smoke that came out? There was no poof of flames or nothing?
No magic. No, there was nothing. I got a little nervous because it was a bigger battery. It was one of my 6-cell batteries, and those are expensive, and they will start a big-ass fire, so you got to be very, very careful.
Yeah, I always hate getting that little solar spot when you plug those things in or you get a spark or you're doing something and you take your screwdriver and you put it across the connectors by accident or you do something like that and you see that big blue spot for the next half hour. That's always a pain.
Right. It makes it kind of tough to fly because your airplane disappears while you're looking in the air. Like, where'd that go? It's in my blind spot. Some stars.
Welding 101.
Oh, that's too funny. So, Larry, you talked about our podcast on radios. Was there anything that you wanted to touch on that you didn't agree with, other than the things we've talked about already? But was there something that really kind of stood out?
No, you guys I thought it was fantastic. Everything I heard, except for what we talked about, I agreed with. I think we pretty much hit on the radios being two different. The generation differences makes for why you can't do certain things with one, but the new Gen 2s and 3s, you can do this, and this, but you can't necessarily copy one model to from a 9 to a 7 or something like that. Like,
Larry, can you expand upon that a little bit? Because you had mentioned something earlier, at least to us, off podcast about that.
Do you have any more information on how the Airware works? I mean, that's their new system, right? Did they change something from the old way to the Airware?
Well, not so much that. It's just that now if you want to work on voice and you want to add voice, they've got the same categories and everything, all the same from a 6 through a 7, which they don't make anymore. They made it for 1 year, the Gen 2, the 8, 9, and as you hit on this in your last podcast, the 18 and the 20. So all the voice systems are real similar now. If I go in and set mine up that I like to have this particular flaps, initiate or gyro initiated and all this kind of stuff, you can do that on any of the radios. They're all the same now. As you know, when you drop in to do travel, sub trim, and all those settings, they're all in the same place. I can grab a 6 and find it in pretty much the same area on the new 6s, which makes it so much easier than trying to remember how do you set flaperons up on a 6i? Totally different, So I really enjoy the fact that if I'm going to help somebody, I don't have to try to remember how I did it on this old radio I had 3 years ago.
Very similar, and I think the wireless buddy box works on all of those as well. So you don't have to go in and figure out different settings for each radio.
That's a whole nother story too. You got Pilot Link masters and programmable master and all that. You got 2 or 3 different ones that you can use, and they vary tremendously. When Luke, my son, in Arizona down there at Juneau, got the 9 before me, I had the 6i, and we had to. He was using programmable master, which meant that I had to put that model pretty much on my radio as well as on his, and everything had to be just perfect. We almost lost a plane when I switched over. I had something different. I'd messed with the mix somewhere on my version, and that
surprise.
Oh yeah! So when we flipped to mine and I threw that switch, it just went straight down like a rocket, And he was able to take it back and get it fixed because, as you know, you can take it back just by moving any of those control surfaces. But If you use the pilot link setting, you basically are just talking from one radio to the other, and you keep everything on the main radio. Let's say that I have all my planes and I want to let my other son fly it. He can fly anything I've got. He can just bind with what he has as a trainer. So he just goes to trainer. I've allowed him to have just the 4 main functions, throttle, elevator, ailerons, and rudder. And so he can fly and do everything, but I can sit there and change trim. I can do everything on my model without him changing anything and affecting that or having any issues. He doesn't have to go through and set that all up each time. Have you guys played with that much?
I've played a little bit with the Buddy Box. I usually do just the pilot, the wireless, where I can just take controls. I did, however, set up one of the switches with audio so that when I flip the switch, it says student has control or instructor has control.
Exactly.
And that way the person next to me knows whenever. They don't know when I actually take control of it, but they know when I give it back to them because it says student has control. It works out really well that way because it helps them and they understand that they're flying and that they have control. I haven't really done what you're talking about, though, where I've used the pilot link. That's a little.
No, I think Michael, we're talking about the same functions. It's just that when you go into what you call Buddy Box mode or trainer mode, it has 2 settings that you can select. You can select programmable mode, or you can select Pilot Link Master. If you go with the Pilot Link Master and use it instead, then you have to make no changes whatsoever to the buddied radio. You just have, yours is all set up, ready to go, and you can then give him which controls you want him to have. Like maybe you don't even want him to have the ailerons. Just make him fly on the rudder like we've talked about. You can turn that off, and so he doesn't have that right stick over there. Even though you got ailerons, the ailerons function won't work. All he has is the other. So you can take the aileron on yours and kind of move it around a little bit to correct things once in a while and so forth. So you don't have to just take it back completely. A lot of neat things you can do with it. But the main thing is all your trims, all your settings, all of your flaps, all your custom switches, your voices, and everything you have, it all functions. You don't have to put it on his radio at all.
So it functions for the airplane that he's flying. So do you bind his radio to your radio, correct? You don't bind. So he's got his, like if I just walked up to the park and somebody was said, hey, I got this T-28 Trojan from E-Flight and I've got a Spectrum DX9 and, they're learning to fly. I can actually just turn my radio on and bind his radio to mine and all his settings stay the same.
No, it's the other way around. The master radio has to be connected directly to the receiver. You then are binding your student radio to the radio that's connected to the receiver. It's the other way around. You would have to actually bind yours, let him hold your radio, and you would then be flying his because it's all set up, it's all trimmed out and everything. Yes, you're right.
It is a little bit of a different feel. My radio is just slightly larger, and the gimbals are a little bit different. But
that's a good point.
He's bragging. Don't fall for it, Larry. He's bragging. Yes, those commoners who may only have a DX9 or a 6. Of course, it's not going to feel the same as my 18. I can barely feel your radio when I'm holding it. Yes. T.
I detect a little jealousy there, don't you?
Boys.
That's the best part about this podcast. We can just rail on each other, and we still love each other.
and you do have the ability to edit.
Yes,
that is correct. So. We do have that.
That's why we sound terrific on the radio. On the podcast.
Yes,
always perfect.
We do.
So I was going to ask Larry. So therefore, let's say we both have the same glider now. So I know, like, if we both have DX9s, I can email you the settings for my glider to you, and you can put them on your radio, and they should work, right? So if I have mine all trimmed out, everything ready to go, voice, all that kind of stuff, I can email you that setting. You can load it up into your radio, and you could fly it. But now, I thought that all the systems 6 through 20 use the airware. That once again, if I mailed somebody my glider to somebody who has a DX6, it doesn't go across. It doesn't work that way. Is that what I understand when I was talking to you before, or?
That's correct. For instance, my son had the Carbon Z before he gave it to me. And a friend of mine here got a new Carbon Z, and I was asked if I would help him set it up and maintain it for him. So I asked my son to mail me his file, and then I took that file and I put it on my radio, and we then set it all up, got it all working. I was then going to be the main person flying, and we took the student whose actually plane it was, and he in turn then connected or bound to my radio. So I was able to take off, give him control. He flew it around a while, and I landed it. So everything was great. We decided we had all the trim right. And of course, you have to change the trim, and you have to watch out for sub trim and all that kind of stuff, because his obviously was different than this new one. So we had to take that part out. But otherwise, yes, you can do what you said. Also, we did change a few things, like you got to be careful. Where do you put your, as you know, on a DX9, you can use any switch for whatever you want. So where do you put your throttle cut? My son puts his on the right side. I put mine on the left side. And so we had to...
Problem. That's a problem.
Why won't it shut off?
Yeah, so you got that. And he uses his switches different for flaps and everything. I mean, that's the beauty. You can customize those radios to your liking, but it also can present a little bit of a challenge when you have to change a bunch of things around. But anyway, we got it all working. So I thought, I'm just going to put this on my card, this SPF, SPM, whatever that file is, then put it in my friend's DX7, new DX7. So we said import, and it said error. There was a problem with one particular thing, and I can't remember what. I could look at my radio, I could tell you what it is, but that particular one had an error where it wouldn't allow me to do that import. So I couldn't do it.
Wow, that's disappointing.
That was to me too. I thought maybe, if nothing else, okay, fine. That isn't going to work. You can't import that function. Fine. Work around it.
So, but it wouldn't let you import anything though, right?
Correct. It just voided the entire import.
Well, that kind of stinks.
Well, I wonder if it's just like anytime you have a radio that's higher than you are, like maybe if you were importing from his DX7 to your 9, it probably would work. But maybe whenever you try to go from a higher radio with more channels to a lower radio, that it doesn't allow you to do that.
That's very possible.
Yeah, it'd be worth checking out anyway, at least, Jay mentioned that you said something earlier about your aircraft being all trimmed up, and then you could just kind of copy it. But the trims actually will come across, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your airplane will be trimmed correctly. Because if your
Exactly.
hardware is set up differently, you have a servo that's turned the wrong way, or you have a longer arm or something like that, you will get those particular settings, but it may exercise that servo differently. Well, we appreciate you joining us here on the Park Flyer podcast to talk about our receivers and radios. Our special guest, Larry. We appreciate you being on the podcast with us, Larry.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure. So for Larry in Colorado Springs and me here in Arizona,
And Jay in the AK.
we appreciate you joining us, and we hope to see you on the next podcast. Good night.
Bye.
You have been listening to the Park Flyer Podcast. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your next visit. Please give our show a star rating and review, and feel free to email us your questions, topics, or suggestions to parkflyerpodcast@gmail.com.